Yesterday, we remembered to thank the farmers, and then Glenn reminded us that this is National Ice Cream Month, and he reminded us to have pizza and lasagna. So thank you, Glenn, for representing our farmers so well. Now, the last 2 days, the hospitality. How about breakfast yesterday? This morning, I believe there were at least 20 different kinds of fruit available. The only thing that wasn't there were mangoes and passion fruit. Holy smokes, this group of people have been working continuously so that we are well fed, taken care of, and feel completely welcome in their presence. Here they are, our wonderful food service leaders from Viterbo University. The first responsibility of leadership is to say, first, I can imagine they when I'm at Quick Trip and they say, anything else? And I go, yes. The first responsibility of leadership is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between the leader is a servant. Of course, conferences like this, gatherings do not happen unless there are people who are doing the work of service, paying attention to details and mailings and lanyards, and making sure that schedules work, and making sure that people's time frames are working. They have a place to stay when we're contacting our speakers. All these details that make a conference, bless you, all these details that make a conference comfortable for all of us. I'd like to introduce to you the people that have really kind of been our leaders pulling us together. Please come out. Here they are. Nicole had her first child in January. And has returned to work, and here she is, a young mom. I saw her on Saturday. I ran in and had a detail that had to be taken care of, and I didn't even realize I was going to meet her at the grocery store, and there she was with her baby daughter. And then she flipped out her phone. She was doing at least 4 things at the same time. She's a director of our Center for Professional Learning and Development, and is just wonderful to work with. Nicole. Jill Miller works with the Ethics Institute. Jill is a connector. She knows who we need to call at any particular moment. She makes sure that people always feel welcome. She is humble, she is gentle, she is strong. Jill Miller. Jenny Waters. Her son Matthew has been playing violin for us. She paid for those lessons. Anytime that people have a question about servant leadership, they don't contact me. If they want a correct answer, they contact Jenny. And then they'll contact me and said, well, I'll give them a different answer. That's not right. I talked to Jenny. I said, well, you're right. She is so thoughtful. She anticipates other people's needs. Remember Radar O'Reilly? That's our Jenny Waters. Thank you very much. And Martha Boehm does nothing but press the joy button at Viterbo every day. She walks across the campus and she smiles. I can't see her without going like this and then dropping my books. In classes, at the end of a class, she'll sum up what she's learned in 3 lines, which are much more profound than what I just spent 16 hours talking about. Articulate, intelligent, insightful, joyful Martha Beam. Thank you all so very much. Yes. Couple thank yous, our sponsors. Without the sponsorship and our partnerships with Organic Valley, Marine Credit Union, Ultra, and Gunderson, this would not have been possible. Thank you for your goodness, your generosity, and friendship. To our friends in the sound booth and all the people that make the Weber Center work, all this technology is beyond my understanding, but it works. We weren't able to get the video to come up because there are so many people in the park that are online that it blocks kind of the way to upload things. I just made that up, but I think it's correct. But thank you so very much. And finally, who's playing, we've started with in the morning and the afternoon, this is our ritual, Matthew Waters. Matthew. Think of the hours of practice, the discipline, the concentration. Matthew is going on to Marquette University where he will major in business administration. Can we imagine 4 or 5 years from now, this good young man leading a group of peers in important projects? Oh, young people these days, you have been a gift to us these last 2 days, Matthew. Thank you very much. This morning, James called us to a deeper sense of connection, to see the connections where oftentimes there's division. John came in and reminded us how the stories of all those who have gone before us have helped to form us and made our lives possible. Linda Belton spent her life serving and leading as a wife, as a mother, as an author, as the director for training and development for the VA system. The VA healthcare system is the largest healthcare system in the world. And remember when James said, examine your biases? An author from the New York Times wrote a book, Best Care Anywhere. He was a New York Times investigative journalist, and he was going to do an expose of the VA system. And what did he find? The best care anywhere. Most effective, most efficient. The VA was the first with medical records. The VA is more deeply committed to wellness because when they have a veteran, they realize that it's for a lifetime. Linda Belton, working in the system, always has believed that every day is Veterans Day. How can we improve the quality of care for all of our veterans? About 15 years ago, I had an opportunity to be at a Greenleaf Conference meeting in Dallas, Texas, and I went to listen to Linda talk about servant leadership in the VA. And she said, is anybody here from Tomah, Wisconsin? Now, we're in our hotel in Dallas, and I raised my hand. And she said, are you Tom Thibodeau? I said, yes. I've heard about you, she said. You're working in the Tomah VA with servant leadership. I said, yes, I am, and I'm very proud of it. Deb Young, former education director at the VA, is with us here today. Thank you for your service, Deb. And when we started that work over 20 years ago, the person sitting in the front row was sitting in the front row at that time, Sherry Shack. Thank you, Sherry, for your presence. So Linda's work represents people like Deb and Sherry across the country who are serving our veterans every day. You can read about her work in the development of human management and the intentional servant leader, but you will learn so much from her presence, her wisdom, and goodness. Linda Belton.
Good afternoon. Glad somebody came back from lunch. Well, a caveat to start out with. First of all, I am going to read these slides peripherally. So if I seem to be stumbling or my back is to you, please excuse that. Also, caveat, I am not a gifted storyteller like our speakers were this morning. I think what I have to share with you today is my experience and my passion for servant leadership. So, all things connected. That's not the title that's written in your program. But if you worked for me over the last 20 years in VA, and somebody said, what do you associate with Linda Belton? It would be all things connected. And I think that's very clearly what we're about here. So the first thing I want to do is get you kind of back in the swing of things. I'm not going to let you take a breath. I want you to do an activity with me. So if you could pull out a little piece of paper, and I want you for the next minute and a half or so, not very long, and I'm hoping that you'll do this more at home, is I want you to write down as many people as you can think of and put a word next to that person that says why you value them. Because in the normal course of daily events, we don't tell people that we appreciate them or we value them. So I want you to think about that intentionally just for a minute. I'm going to time you. Okay, we're going to call time. I know that's not much time. There are a lot of people you know, but do you get the idea of sitting there and actually thinking of people that you work with, that you live with, and think about a word or two that says, this is why they're important to me. So I would urge you to use this. This is a great team activity, and I think that you'll find it has really profound results. Now take it one step further. And when you go back home or you go back to your job, I want you to consider telling that person why you value them. Sometimes we don't think that that will be received well, but my experience shows me that it has profound results. And what it does is strengthen our connection. It helps us to interrelate and interweave. So consider using that in your own workplaces. Was that helpful at all? Is that something you can use? Okay. So, talking about weaving, you're going to find that I have a lot of faith and find a lot of wisdom in song lyrics and song titles. You're going to see a few of those today. And one of my favorites is Carole King's Tapestry. My life is just a tapestry. So how do we weave all of these things together? Because everything is connected to everything else. And all things connected is not just a snappy tagline. It's a truth, and it's rooted in science. So I'm going to take a risk this afternoon in going deep in a couple of areas. So here's the first one. Quantum physics teaches me a lot about leadership. So the first concept in quantum physics is field theory. So subatomic particles are situated in vast areas of space. We often think that those are empty areas of space. They're not. They are filled with fields, with gravitational fields, with electromagnetic fields, with cyber fields, all fields that we can't see, but we can feel. We know they're there. Scientists like Sheldrake and Capra have postulated that there are also morphogenic fields, fields that influence behavior. And those are what create the culture. So what lessons do we learn? Think for a minute about the organizational impact of fields. Imagine service fields, respect fields, civility fields, ethics fields, team fields, all those positive value fields. Imagine those filling your workplace. That is what creates your culture. Who creates that culture? The leader does. And we do it by consistent modeling of those behaviors and messaging time after time. So fields determine our organizational culture. So a real lesson, I think, from quantum physics. Anybody familiar with the Nazca lines in Peru? This is very interesting to me because this is the 30,000-foot level. These are glyphs. They are prehistoric glyphs in the deserts and sands of Peru. Now, if you are walking in this area in Peru, you don't see any of this. You see furrows in the sand, in the ground. It takes rising to the 30,000-foot level to see the patterns and the relationships that are there. Fascinating. And to me, it says systems thinking. And I believe that's an imperative cultural characteristic of the servant leader. So I remember the first time I looked at my house on a Google map. So what I saw was, there's my house, somewhere in there, but what I didn't know is there's a park over here, and the grocery store that I go to over here, I can get to in a much easier way. And there are some neighborhoods back here that I would like to explore. I don't see those when I'm at ground level, when I'm in the weeds. And that's where we are most of the time when we walk into work in the morning. So servant leaders need to be systems thinkers. They need to see the big picture. And so we need to zoom out to that 30,000-foot level, scan the environment, because that's where we can detect the connections, the relationships, and the patterns. Organizations are organisms. We hope that they're healthy organisms, living organisms. And what that means to me is that they are a collection of systems, and we have to see how do those systems interface with each other. So we need to understand, as leaders, the flow of the organization. And being a healthcare professional, I call that the organization's circulatory system. So this facilitates foresight, which Greenleaf certainly advises, which is visionary and intuitive. I sometimes call it informed stargazing or predictive plausibility. So organizations are webs of connection. So we know that the meaningful work in an organization transpires at those nodes of connection. That everything we do, every decision we make, every policy we create has ripple effects. There is an interrelatedness of each entity to each other entity. For example, if I'm in the nursing department of a hospital, I have to relate to the business office in the hospital. If I am in the purchasing department of a company, I have to relate to the customer service part of the company. It's all interrelated. And we know that one decision in one area can affect another area. That a policy can help one team and can impair another team. and that an unresolved problem today can become a crisis tomorrow. So our organizations are indeed webs of connection. Well, so are people, because we are organisms, we are human organisms. There are many things in common with the organization. I can't relate to you just as a professional or just in an economic transaction. I have to look at you as a multidimensional human being, and I have to relate to you in that way, because people are also webs of connection, and all things are connected. So servant leadership is relationship-based. We relate one-on-one. We relate in kind of loose associations with people. Sometimes we form groups. If we're fortunate, we become part of an engaged and effective team, which means it's certainly very different from a group. An engaged and effective team takes care of the functions of the team, but also pays attention to the relationships of the team. This leads us to a servant-led organization and then to a servant-led community. So it's all related. It's a tapestry, huh? So people are the who side of connection. No matter how separate we seem or choose to be, we are all cut from the same cosmic cloth. I'm going to share an exercise with you that I learned to do, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. What you see here is a room with people around a table. And what I find is that you focus on the space between and around those participants. The more divisive the issue that's about to be discussed, the bigger the space is. And so the focal point in this picture is separateness. Now, look at the same image in photographic negative. And when we do this, what we see is that the participants fade and the space that's between and around them seems to be the focal point. So instead of separating people, that space binds them together. It becomes the field, the spirit, the consciousness, the energy that fills the gaps between those people at a quantum level. It's a uniter, not a separator. I ran into this when I was doing a lot of public speaking in audiences that weren't particularly conducive to hearing my message. And what I found is, and I'm using it right now, that if I go into a meeting of 12 people in a boardroom, and I know this is going to be a very tough issue we're going to discuss, we're going to be at loggerheads, instead of seeing us separately at the table, I pull us together in a bubble, and it's different. I'm doing that with you right now. I'm not looking at you as 300 people who are sitting in separate seats. I'm looking at us as all in the same bubble. So at a quantum level, we are united by this space. We're not divided by it. So hopefully that's a tool that you can use when you go into a meeting that's contentious. I see servant leadership as a charism. So we're all familiar with the word charisma. It's that personal magic that arouses exceptional loyalty and enthusiasm. But charisma is at its peak when it arises from a deeply held charism. So what is a charism? It's a grace or a special power or a virtue that's used to benefit an organization or a community. Charism stems from the love of service and the love of each other. I really kind of see it as a contract. It's both a blessing and a responsibility. The principles that I follow and the promises that I make. For example, I not only believe in primus inter pares, I will demonstrate it. I not only have integrity, I will use integrity. I not only preach stewardship, I will practice it. Servant leadership, I believe, comes from that charism, the love of service, and the love of each other. Well, Tina Turner says, what's love got to do with it? I'm feeling heartened at the amount of conversation that I see online, on LinkedIn, places like that they're starting to talk about how do we discuss love in the workplace? Oh, that was taboo 20 years ago. I love this. And I've done a lot of thinking about it. And I think that love is the simple truth at the core of complexity. There are a lot of different kinds of love. Most of those have Greek names for them. But there are two that I think are particularly relevant to servant leadership. The first one is philia. This is an emotional connection, strong affection between friends or colleagues, a powerful bond that forms community. So our teams, hopefully, are practicing philia. But I think there's a higher calling in servant leadership, and that's agape. Agape is not just the emotion. How did Tom describe it a little while ago? It's love in action. That's agape. It's love that demonstrates itself through action. So it's an all-in commitment. We don't have a 50-50 relationship. We have a 100-100 relationship. And it is intentional. So what does it mean to be intentional? I believe that things don't just happen. They flow from intention. And I define that as having a couple of characteristics. One, it has to be deliberate. It has to be well thought out. We're working from a blueprint. It has to be conscious. So we're mindful of the framework and we're vigilant to distraction from that framework. It's purposeful. I have to pay attention to aligning my words and my decisions and my actions. A lot of people go into a meeting with a set intention. The concern for me is that it shouldn't just be my intention. It needs to be broader than that. So I've expanded my definition to include receptive. And that means that I have to, as a leader, be accessible, approachable. I have to invite feedback. And I have to be open to the diverse thoughts and ideas of the other people in the group, and truly to the stirrings of a higher consciousness. What is Spirit leading me to do in this group? So intention is the consistency of thought and action that makes serving more than merely accidental or incidental. It is the work behind the wish to become a servant leader. Intention answers these questions. How do I transform the rhetoric of servant leadership into everyday operations? How does servant leadership look different in the way I carry out my responsibilities? Because it has to look different. How will my staff identify me as a servant leader? And how do I actualize the best test? Because you are not a servant leader until others see you as one. As I've gone around the country and talked about servant leadership, there are a lot of misperceptions that keep getting thrown at me. And these are two, and kind of at the opposite ends. Always hear this one. I can't be a servant leader because servant leader is not strong leadership, and I have to be seen as a tough boss. I don't want my people walking all over me. About a year ago, I was teaching a group of people, and they said at the conclusion, well, then servant leadership is just about being nice. And, I went away from there thinking, where did I fail in that? Because servant leadership is hard work. And so I've given a lot of thought to that, and I'm calling it putting the meat on the bones of servant leadership. It's the hard work of caring, or what I term it, humanagement. So yes, the servant leader has to be tough and nice. So the servant leader says, yes, the buck stops here. I am accountable. But practices primus inter pares, offers others a seat at the table. The servant leader acts decisively and presents confidently, but understands the impacts of their decisions, able to adapt, is resilient. The servant leader has high expectations, but listens sensitively, judges fairly, and shows compassion. And the servant leader is results-oriented, demands excellence, but gives people the encouragement and autonomy to produce those results. So hard work. There are 3 hallmarks of a servant leader that I keep going back to over and over again. The first one is humility. Humility is not self-deprecation, abasement, false modesty. It's not that, aw shucks kind of modesty and humility that we learned about as children. Humility is, in Greenleaf's terms, the ability to learn from and gratefully receive the gifts of the less powerful. It's also the ability to accept that we don't know something, to ask for help, to acknowledge mistakes, to admit fear. So humility makes us vulnerable, and I consider humility an unprotected place. The second hallmark is courage. It takes courage to practice humility and to make hard decisions, to take risks, delegate, to be honest, and to do what's right, not just expedient. One of Martin Luther King's favorite quotes of mine is, "Let us develop a kind of dangerous generosity." And so generosity is my third hallmark. It's generosity of time, of talent, of spirit, of giving opportunities, and all of that speaks to me of agape, and all-in love of the people that I work with and live with. So, if it's that tough, is servant leadership worth it? I think you all have your own minds made up about that. But subjectively, these are some things that come to my mind. It's an experience of connectedness, the focus of serving followers for their own good, not just the good of the organization, for a concern with the success of all stakeholders. And I believe that it helps with a healing of self, and it allows us to present a healing presence to others, and clearly being in community. So that's the subjective data. What about the objective data? Well, VA has done an awful lot of objective measurement of servant leadership. This is a little bit dated, but I think it's really profound. What we found was that merely the perception of servant leadership led to results in organizational outcomes, such as improved workplace respect, cooperation, conflict resolution, personal interest and reliability, satisfaction with the supervisor, diversity and inclusion, and a sense of psychological safety. Measurable results, even if the person wasn't really a great servant leader, but people perceived that she was. Also, business outcomes. And this is where you can really make the economic argument to your fiscal people. We found that there is a measurable increase in employee performance, in job satisfaction, in customer satisfaction, and in a return on the investment. And even more interesting is that it decreases sick leave usage, decreases EEO, union, customer complaints. It decreases accidents and incidents. Can you imagine that? Measurable decrease in accidents and incidents on the job. One that I love is that it decreases the length of stay of a patient in ICU. Who would have thought? And it decreases burnout in professionals. You guys still with me? Well, I'm going to go into something that's a little hard and a little risky, but I'm going to talk to you about this. If it's difficult to maintain relationships in normal times, how do we maintain relationships in those times that are anything but normal? Things like COVID, all the other things that we go through, any times of peril or hardship. I had a person actually say to me about a year ago, "This is not the time to practice servant leadership. You got to put that away until the crisis is past." It reminded me immediately of a time, and I'm not going to give names, but when I was working in Wisconsin, and there was a political election coming up, and I was in a political position, and the person said to me, "You must do this, this, and this to help me be reelected." I said, "I don't find that ethical." He said, "You better put aside the ethics or you won't have a job tomorrow." And I said, "This is the time I need to hold those ethics." And that's how important I think servant leadership is in times of hardship and peril. Servant leadership in the context of work and in the context of life cannot be put on and taken off like a suit of clothes, and it can't be waived until the crisis passes. So if you're going into being a servant leader and practicing those principles, and it may not be the popular thing to do at this moment in time, know that you have to be prepared to lose. You may lose position, influence, communication platform, friendship, respect, any of those things. It's possible. So in the face of hardship, complexity, unpredictability, could be anything from economic downturns to staff shortages to political upheaval to pandemics. How do we then protect those relationships? And how do we preserve the tenets of servant leadership? I gave this a lot of thought for a long time. And I'll tell you what I came up with was my best framework was going to be the best test. I can't say that I ever tried to really actualize it before, but I have in this regard. And so I'm going to share it with you right now as a self-assessment. This says COVID in the best test, but you could substitute any kind of hard time in that title. So this is what I asked myself. And trying not to be political in one direction or another, these are questions to ask. Is the way that we went through COVID, and as we step back and can look at what we did, are people healthier physically, mentally, economically, spiritually, relationally? Are they wiser? Have we learned from our experience? Are we stronger intellectually? Have we balanced science against common sense? Have we engaged in discernment and thoughtful discourse? Are we freer? What is the effect of mandates? Have we encouraged innovation to solve the problem? How do we handle dissent? What role has fear played? And I keep going back to the lesson of the biology of the cell membrane, that an organism cannot be in both fear and growth states at the same time, because fear has a chilling effect on growth. Are we more autonomous? So I think about the ethical principle of autonomy versus the greater good. Who makes that decision? What has been the effect on judgment, self-determination, and critical thinking skills? Greenleaf said, coercive control breeds resistance. Belton says, control is an illusion. We know that service rolls downhill. So, in the wake of all that we have done, are people more likely themselves to become servants? Centralized decision-making teaches dependence. The polarization of spaces and the erasing of faces tend to isolate and dehumanize. We heard about that this morning. So, is the social distancing and masking, has that inhibited altruism and service? And if it has, how do we regain that? How do we bring people back to wanting to be altruistic and to be servants themselves? And what is the effect on the least privileged? How do we preserve economic viability, inspire generosity, prevent poverty of spirit, counter vulnerability? And who are the least privileged in your environment? And while I'm talking Greenleaf here, I have to go to his quote about the difference manifesting itself in the care taken by the servant first to make sure that others' highest priority needs are being served. I think of a couple of examples here. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a homeless person on the street with a sign I hadn't seen before. It says, "Please give everything you can, even if it's only a smile." Or I think of my situation with Dr. Marv. Dr. Marv wanted to make an appointment with me several times a week. I had a very busy schedule, and he'd come in and talk business for 5 minutes, and then we'd get into what's going on in his family. He'd read me some of his original poetry, that type of thing. It took an hour every time, and at one point my secretary came up to me and said, "Do you want me to just put him off? I don't know why you give him so much time." And I said to her, because that is what he needs. Or the dying patient. A nurse came up to me one day and said, "I don't think I should be a nurse anymore. I skipped several of my treatments. I was late with my medications. The only thing I was able to do today was to sit with Mr. Smith while he was dying." So what do the people in your life need? The people at your workplace. Some of mine needed a little patience, a pat on the back, a project, something to challenge them, a seat at the decision-making table, to be included. Maybe some of them needed a kick in the pants every now and then. So what do your people need? What do people need? People only need what they don't have. So we're here to renew, to restore, to re-energize, and to reconnect. And I've got to tell you that as I was creating this slide, my cat walked across the keyboard. And the whole thing was lost. And I panicked for a moment, and then I remembered, restore. So I found the restore button, and voila, it's back. And it made me think, Why don't we have a restore button for our relationships? We've put relationships on hold for a couple of years, or our relationships are all through Zoom. It's time to restore and back those up. We know that it's easier to recruit employees than to retain them. That takes work. It's easier to build relationships than to restore them. It's easier to adopt servant leadership than to sustain it. Any Seinfeld fans in the audience? Do you remember the episode where he goes to the car rental counter and he says, they don't have a car for him. He says, you know how to make the reservation, you just don't know how to hold the reservation. And I think that's it. At times of crisis, show us whether our commitment to servant leadership has legs. Servant leadership affirms the dignity of the person, the dignity of work, the ethics of self-determinism, our responsibility to each other, and the duty of dissent. In the long run, relationships are what matter. So life is art, and work is the canvas on which we display our souls. I used to ask leaders, would you describe yourself as a good organization leader or a good servant leader? And the obvious answer is, there should be no difference. Okay, ready for another quantum physics lesson? I'll make it quick. This one is about non-local phenomena or quantum entanglement. Einstein found this and called it spooky action at a distance. It's the idea that there are two quantum particles and they can be so deeply entwined that what happens to one happens to the other, even if they're on opposite sides of the universe. They're that deeply entwined. How often have people in different places come up with the same idea at the same time? We know of inventions that have been discovered at two different places at the same time. Have you ever answered the phone and said, I was just thinking about you? So what do we learn from this? Virtual employees and virtual teams may be connected in unanticipated ways. And I think we've found that. And I believe that we'll continue to work in virtual ways more than we ever did before. So it's up to us to be intentional about creating relationships through those virtual paths. Thoughts and ideas are quantum property. We sometimes call this synchronicity. And the impact of relationships transcends time and space. So it's time to come down from our fences and open the gates. I couldn't have said it better. We're all leaders all the time. No one gets a pass, and no service is trivial service. Servant leaders are not always people of power, but they are always powerful people. And power has very little to do with where you sit on the organizational chart, how many budget dollars are at your command, how many people you supervise. Power is the capacity generated by relationships. Relationships take us to community. So we know that our work world is very fast-paced. We're in the weeds all the time. And in this world, people are often seen as distractions, and relationships are seen as interruptions to the work. But in a servant leader environment, people are the focus, and relationships are the raison d'etre. So community is the goal of relationships. It's a kinship of like minds. And I think that's the beauty of having a group of people here today. It fosters genuine connection, sets a climate of respect, provides opportunities for interaction, and allows everyone to feel heard, because we know that when people are allowed to speak their minds, then they are better bonded to the community. Staying connected in a virtual world is different, but servant-led organizations are indeed communities because they celebrate traditions, roots and purpose, connections and relationships, milestones and successes and legacies. And I believe that they offer a safe environment for the working out of what servant leadership means to each one of us in daily life. So community can be in physical proximity or in virtual space. And I love the way Parker Palmer puts it. Community doesn't mean living face-to-face with others. Rather, it means never losing the awareness that we are connected to each other. To me, this is really kind of a spiritual concept. It's a field. And to me, community is an amazing grace. So let me talk just for a minute about the spiritual side of servant leadership. We talk about spirituality, we're not talking about religion. Spirit is the sense or ethos. It's a field that connects, and it's the animating force of the organization. What research shows us is that human beings have 3 universal spiritual needs. One is love and relatedness. We need to know somebody cares, that we're connected in some way. Purpose and meaning. Why am I here? Was I just plopped down here for the fun of it? I have to have some meaning. And forgiveness. I need to know that you forgive me for my failings. I forgive you for yours. And I also forgive myself for not being everything I would like myself to be. I've identified 4 spiritual qualities of a servant leader. The first one is inspiration. So the servant leader needs to generate enthusiasm and create space for people to catch that spirit. Trust. We have to demonstrate respect, transparency, and consistency. I call it my no surprises rule. If I'm your supervisor, you need to know what I think about you at all times. When I give you your annual evaluation, you should know exactly what it's going to say. No surprises, transparent. It's important when you're generating trust to apply rules impartially, communicate honestly, share credit, behave ethically, and ensure a psychologically safe environment. And of course, delegating is important, and avoiding the micromanagement is even more important. The best example I've ever seen was at a company in Wisconsin where my daughter used to work. It was a computer firm, and the people in management suddenly realized that there were a lot of office supplies that were going out the door. They were starting to lose way too much money in the loss of office supplies. So they got together and talked about what they could do. So one person said, well, we could put a guard at the door, and when they walk out, we can have their bags inspected, and that should put a stop to it. Some enlightened person said, what about if we give them what they need? So they put a cabinet by the time clock and filled it with Post-it notes and pencils and paper clips and rubber bands and whatever it is that you need. And they put a sign on the front saying, please take what you need and leave the rest for others. This was a win-win. Employees said, our management trusts us. And management said, our employees are adults, they can do the right thing. That's generating trust. The third one is stewardship. So we don't own our organizations or our teams or our departments. We are guardians of them. They are on loan to us. And we need to leave the place better than we found it, with interest. The last one is mercy. This is tough for a lot of leaders because, how can I be merciful? I'm where the buck stops. People have to be accountable. Well, that's very true. Mercy is not a free pass for bad behavior. Mercy travels with accountability. Servant leaders are caring enough to hold people accountable and strong enough to show them mercy. And while we're at it, I'm going to share with you, I'm really revealing a lot of myself today in these little activities, but this is one that I used to do about every 6 months. So I've got it up here, and you can certainly take it home and use it if you would like. By the way, I have notations there. These are all in the books that are for sale out in the lobby. So what I would do every 6 months was to sit in a quiet, dark room, close my eyes, and think about those people that I might have hurt during the last 6 months. Maybe I was insensitive. Maybe I was angry and lashed out. Maybe I put a policy in effect and didn't think about the impact it would have on them. Maybe it even had an impact on their family that was detrimental. So I think about that. I know their names. I see their faces. It's that personal. And then I ask them to forgive me. And then I forgive myself, and I move on. And I do this every 6 months. If this moves you, here is a format that you can use. Think about how those times where you failed to show mercy or kindness have helped you to grow as a leader. I know you all saw this yesterday, so I'm not going to read it again. But I think that Greenleaf's concept of a spirit carrier is certainly appropriate here. I can't finish without talking for a minute about the leader as follower. So, I've said a couple times here, we're all leaders. We're all the time. Nobody gets a pass. Everybody has to step up. Now I'm telling you that leaders are also followers. Well, it's true, because leadership doesn't always mean taking charge. Our leader and follower roles ebb and flow. And in one of my books, I call this the dance of leadership. We are both, often at the same time. I'm a wife to my husband, and I'm a professional to my staff. I'm a mother to my children, and I'm a daughter to my parents. You think of some. What examples can you think of? I'm a team leader here, but I report to a department head, so I'm a follower there. See what I'm saying? So we are constantly leaders and followers. Marianne Williams says, you might think you're the leader, but you're following something. And so I've given a great deal of thought to how does servant leadership translate into servant followership. And here are the characteristics that I've come up with. The servant follower is loyal, but does not show mindless deference. The servant follower can say no, can say, I don't think that's right. Could we try something else? Or I can't do that extra shift today. The servant leader is offering resources. The servant follower is a steward of those resources. Where the servant leader gives opportunities for growth, the servant follower takes advantage of opportunities for growth. The servant follower gives thoughtful opinions and helpful feedback. I can't help thinking of the many times that I've seen a leader stand up in a group like this and say, I'm announcing the new policy. This is what it's going to look like. And if you've got any ideas, we've got time to tweak it. So what do you think? And there's nothing until they go out into the hall. And then everybody's got these great ideas. The servant follower says, I'm going to give that information and my opinions and feedback when it can be of use. The servant follower represents the organization respectfully and always knows that they have to be ready to step up and take their turn at leading. So people in authority can command us to obey, submit, or conform, but they cannot order us to follow because followership comes from the heart. Servant leaders don't demand followership, they inspire it. And that tells me that regardless of all the guidelines and principles and tenets of servant leadership, you have to make it your own. The mamas and papas say it best. You got to make your own kind of music. You have to make this work for your own personality, your own leadership, your own organization. And what that is leading toward a legacy. The people that you touch may never realize it was you who touched them. They just experience your effect. A legacy is accumulated day by day, year by year, action by action. We are known by the legacies we create long before we leave them. You are creating your legacy right now. So legacy is the unbroken thread of relationship. And sometime when you have a minute, think about how you want to be remembered. Just a couple of quick phrases. So, seeing through a lens of servant leadership, this sums it all up for me. And I see it very seriously. Servant leadership is not a technique, it's a way of life. And for me, if it's not based on a personal and immutable truth, then why? Why do we bother? It has to be that deep. Service is not a byproduct of leadership, it's the whole point. Traditional leaders can be good bosses and get good results. We've all had good leaders who were traditional. But servant leaders can be great bosses and get great results. Servant leaders create healthy organizations. We choose servant leadership over and over and over again. Every time we make a decision, write a policy, craft a budget, relate to another person, we choose servant leadership or we don't, because servant leadership is intentional. And again, I'm not a servant leader until others see me as one. I want to end up by reading you a piece from one of my books, if you don't mind me reading. I have always been fascinated by the power of a name. Do you remember the 1980-ish mystery series, Murder, She Wrote? In perpetual reruns since then, the title character, Jessica Fletcher, has a knack for calling everyone by name. Bellmen, waiters, parking garage attendants, and how they all respond. I watch with fascination as they go out of their way to serve her. I think of so many other examples. My colleague Casey teaches large numbers of employees, and she remembers every one of them by name. This doesn't come naturally to me. You may have noticed me looking at name tags throughout the day. I have to look at those name tags, write it down, or come up with mnemonics. It requires intention. Then there is the elderly man at church who has intermittent memory problems. During a recent service, I reached out to him at the appointed time to say, "Peace be with you, Roger." It was pure joy when he responded, "And also with you, Linda." At long last, he had spoken my name. In A Nobler Side of Leadership, The Art of Humanagement, I used names to credit colleagues for a thought or a phrase that found its way into the material. Thank you, Tom Thibodeau, for example. Asterisk at the bottom of the page noted his contribution to my work. This was not a formal citation, but an affectionate recognition and an attempt to be a servant leader while writing about servant leadership. So what does any of this have to do with the everyday realities of organizational life? Servant leaders need all the help they can get. Remaining in the ivory towers of our offices or our minds, putting space between us and them, or staying professionally and positionally aloof creates a distance that is hard to bridge. Titles and hierarchies can serve to separate us from one another. Acknowledging a name is a path to relationship. How many people do you have regular interaction with and don't know their names? I have overlooked the power of that for many years, but now I make a point of finding out and addressing by name those with whom I intersect even for a moment. The restaurant server, the post office clerk, the checker at the market, the woman who cleans my office, the new employee down the hall. And the results are remarkable. A link, a bond, an instant, if momentary recognition of a fellow traveler. The ring of a name is sweet. It says, you are worth remembering. It beckons us to a deeper connection. It summons us to personal and profound service. You are invited to listen to that voice and to be that voice. Whether it is you who are being called or you who are calling others, the message is, this is no accident. This is not a fluke. This is intentional. You have been called by name. So I want to thank you for letting me have some time with you today.
Yesterday, you heard the name of Anne McGee Cooper evoked. She was mentored by Robert Greenleaf and was rather the grandmother of the servant leadership movement. Here's her intellectual sister who's carried on the work. What you have just listened to was the distillation of 40 years of experience. This is what we call wisdom, knowing what is good for oneself, one's community, and the world. We have been blessed by the experience, the wisdom, the spirit carrier, Linda Belton.